and David's going to help us do that, and also what effect that can have on us right here on the Central Coast. So first of all, I think what I wanted to do is just put it a little bit in context, if I could, for a little bit. So I want to give you a little bit of history about affordable housing. Many of you probably already know this, or are probably more versed in it, but it's helpful. And I think also give you a little bit about people's self-help housing before I move on to our speaker. So a little history lesson about affordable housing. So we know Congress enacted this thing in 1937, a Housing Act, but nothing really happened to it until probably 1965, and that's when it actually became a cabinet-level position within the President's cabinet. And then we know that there were the riots and what have you, unrest that happened in the 1968. 1968 were the riots, and out of that, people started to talk about affordable housing and poverty, and it sort of got the discussion going. It's when Ginnie Mae became started to happen, and mortgages for moderate-income families started to happen. And so about that same time, there was a group of people on the Central Coast who are sort of visionary, like we do a lot of things on the Central Coast. So they actually said, you know, we have an affordable housing issue here on the Central Coast as well, and we need to do something about it. And we see something happening in Washington. So they created People's Self-Help Housing, and that was in 1970. So we've been around for a while, and just when things were starting to get going. So after that, we do know that in '72 there was two housewives, if you will, Gail Sonata and Shelley Trapp, who in Chicago decided that the banks were not making loans in distressed areas and low-income areas. So they actually sat outside Bank of America, I think it was, and other banks, and said, you need to do something about lending to poor people. And their efforts, really starting with the two of them, really kicked off a lot of things. So that's when we got the home mortgage disclosure in 1972, which requires banks to report where they make loans and to whom. So that reporting, and then you know they were doing redline, which was taking money from lower income people and not willing to make loans. And so that was a really important way for disclosure with the Home Disclosure Act. In 1972, USDA gets on board, and they start making the loan programs to farm workers in rural areas, and we start to see USDA get into it. The Community Reinvestment Act happens in 1977, and that's now under the Comptroller of the Currency. And now, so they now look at all bank acquisitions and making sure when the bank comes into an area that they're serving all the population. So it was a really big movement, obviously. And then in '74, the CDBG grants started to happen. And then in '78, actually Congress created a nonprofit called Neighborhood Reinvestment Corporation. And it was a nonprofit directly funded out of Congress that said, go out and help affordable housing and do things across the country. So that was a really big initiative. And they eventually changed their name in 1975 to the NeighborWorks America. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because we're actually part of that. And then in 1990, the Home Fund program sort of kicked in. So all these programs kind of came, as I say, and so in 1970 we were sort of ahead of that as far as here on the local Central Coast. Our office is here, and so we were following all that, advocating for that. So sort of on the front line of doing that, both in DC and in Sacramento, for affordable housing for everyone, and specifically here on the Central Coast, as these programs and policies were being discussed. So this year we celebrate our 45th year of existence. We have 45 sites, coincidentally, and we have 1,570 rental units with 5,000 residents that we house on a daily basis, and then we have 1,200 self-help homes, roughly, I think we keep roughly round numbers of sweat equity homes that we've produced in that time. So our geographical footprint is from San Miguel all the way to Ventura, and we have 172 employees, so that sometimes we're the best kept secret. People don't really realize maybe how large or how big a spread that we have. So we continue to be a strong advocate for affordable housing, both here and in Washington, D.C. and in Sacramento. We were a charter member of the National Rural Housing Coalition, and that opens doors for us. I was in last week, I was in D.C. meeting with Boxers and Feinstein, McCarthy's, and CAP's office, advocating for affordable housing. We've been in the Comptroller's office talking with Tom Curry and about bank acquisitions, what's happening with Union Bank in our area, and those kinds of things. We were one of the first groups to get in to see Mel Watt after Obama appointed him to talk about Freddie and Franny and what's happening with the earnings that are coming out of those and going into affordable housing into the National Trust. And that's starting to see some movement. And then, of course, we were talking with Julian Castro, who is the HUD Secretary, about home and CDBG, Tom Vilsack at USDA. And so we really try and be involved in what's happening in Sacramento. But in addition, we were a charter member of the state coalition as well. And that's the California Rural California Coastal Rural Housing, or something not close to that. California Coalition of Rural Housing, thank you. And so yesterday I was in Sacramento meeting with the governor's housing secretary, talking about with Ann Caparillo about cap and trade, and how can we get the greenhouse gases, put jobs next to transportation, and how can we get that to trickle down to the rural areas. So, and then of course we're working with various groups with the Speaker of Assembly, Tony Atkins, who's carrying the water for us right now with the state budget, and seeing those things. So all those things are really important, and things that we get involved in. And finally, we're a member, as I mentioned, of NeighborWorks America, which goes around America and looks for strong nonprofits, housing providers like us. There's 250 of them they've identified. We're one of them. We're number 21 on their list in America, so we're pretty high, pretty well run, and they help us with sustainability, cash management, governance, and all kinds of things. So those are all great affiliations, and in addition, I get to meet with other executive directors from all over the country, and we get to discuss the latest trends and threats and opportunities and challenges that are affecting affordable housing in the country. And in one of those conferences today, that's where I heard our speaker, David Smith. And I was in Washington, D.C. attending a NeighborWorks America conference, and they had David come in to inform us and challenge us as to what to expect to deliver for affordable housing. And in light of the changing trends and the limited national and state funding, what is it we should be looking at, and where should we be pointing our resources? So, so that brought me full circle to David's presentation today. And so David is a Harvard graduate. He's a great guy.
You have to tell him.
I had to tell him that.
You don't have to tell him that.
David's a Harvard graduate. I just want you to know how excited I am to have him here, because he has 35 years of complex affordable housing transactions, programs, and policies. He's a founder of Affordable Housing Institute out of Massachusetts. He's played a principal role in designing global leading initiatives like Sun Dweller International and working with the Urban Poor Fund. He has more than 200 published articles from the Community Reinvestment Act goes global to such things as how do private and public stakeholders can respond to emerging capital, housing, and financing trends. He's a speaker at such conferences as the World Urban Fund, the World Bank Global Housing Trust Fund, the World Habitat Day, and as I say, he's sought after as a speaker for NeighborWorks America to speak about housing programs and policies in America, and as well as advisory to the U.S. Senate Housing Subcommittee on Housing. So as you can see, he has a big credential, and I was really pretty impressed with him. He's high energy, just like me, and fast-paced speaker, and when I heard him in D.C., I knew I had to try and get him out here to speak to not only my board, which you'll hear him tonight, or tomorrow, but share with you and our community in the hopes of furthering and enhancing our own discussion about the future of affordable housing here on the Central Coast. And so with that, I'm going to introduce David Smith.
If you want to be a good speaker, there's only 4 things you have to do. Start on time, end on time. We will be done at 3 o'clock. Talk about what you say you're going to talk about, and make sure nobody's bored. And I pretty much can guarantee that none of you will be bored. Now, I should mention, by the way, that all of you have a complex signaling device here called your cognomen or your fizz or otherwise. If you find yourself bored, it is common in situations like this either to sneak down at the little electronic master that controls our lives, or to close the eyes or stuff like that. And if you do, I will call on you. So just bear that in mind, okay? So what I'm going to do, one other thing that's always useful to do is to tell people what you're going to tell them about. Because I will tend to talk a little bit fast, and I will use jargon when excited. So I want to give you, I'm going to put it in 4 basic buckets. 1, what is going on with affordable housing and communities? John alluded to the fact that we use these words, if not interchangeably, at least in a connected way. 2, what makes a community successful? I think we all can perceive when a community is successful or not. If you happen to be driving someplace and you get off the wrong turn in the freeway and the person in the passenger seat decides to lock the doors, that's probably an indication you've entered a not so successful community. So you have an ability to perceive it, but it helps to understand what it is. The third thing is communities become successful not by chance. Some things help them become more successful. And then finally, because I'm a housing guy, I want to talk about how affordable housing in particular fits in with communities and how challenges and opportunities connect. And then, in the copious extra time available before 3 o'clock, you will run out of questions before I run out of answers, okay? So, I start by showing you an image of the most popular show in Washington, D.C. This is a show, if you have not watched it, about a megalomaniac, psychopathic murderer who becomes President of the United States just for the power. This is the most popular show in Washington. So I ask you first question. Who owns the problem of successful communities? It ain't Frank Underwood, I will tell you that. And to be a little more close to home, it will not even necessarily be your friends and mine in Sacramento. Because a state is a larger economic unit. A state is about state economic competitiveness. Cap and trade, to take an example that John alluded to, was not created with the idea of helping make better communities. Better communities either are going to happen or not happen, but cap and trade was created for a reason that had nothing to do with community. Okay? So then, whose job is it to make communities successful? Well, I'm going to show you a picture of the most popular show on AMC. It's called The Walking Dead. And in case you can't see the picture very well, the people who aren't zombies are inside a prison with concertina wire, because outside those prison walls are the zombies who want to eat us. And I will suggest to you, the reason I put those particular images up there is because television reflects the zeitgeist. And the zeitgeist says Washington is the enemy and the stranger has no brain. And if you put those two ideas together, you suddenly start to say, who makes a community successful? It's the people here. Now this is complicated because we live in a world in which that isn't science fiction anymore. That's not Tippi Hedren and the birds. Now, what are in those little drones? Who knows? Globalized things are in those little drones. The biggest point of this is that we are in the 21st century and there ain't no going back. One feature of the 21st century, which is really important, is that all borders are porous. People borders, idea borders, money borders, job borders, they are all porous. They can be faster or slower. What seeps through the barrier can be good or bad, okay? But the borders are porous, and the borders change, the porosity of borders changes our little community. Now, you might say that in a world of drones and stuff like that, and a world of dematerialized value chains and global banking, that all of those things devalue place. Except for the fact that, as you all demonstrated before you came in, when you all came in, you talked to each other. You talked to each other in a very hi, how are you, glad to see you, friendly way. The guy from out of town sat over here by himself feeling lonely. Okay? That's true. One or two brave souls wanted to make sure I wouldn't bite anybody. Okay? People live on a neighborhood scale. And so we have a funny thing that happens right now. America will succeed in the 21st century if and only if we do two things. One, create a better climate for brains, because brains are where money comes from. And two, if we create a climate in which the rule of law and private property are respected. Because, you know, if you're a rich guy in China, the biggest thing you do is to try to figure out how to get money out of China into some place that's got a better quality of life for your kids. $80 billion a year goes out of China sub rosa. A lot of it buys golf courses in America, or condos in Seattle, or probably fancy ranch houses somewhere in SLO. Okay? They're buying it because you have something called successful community. So how do we make that happen? I'm going to do the following so fast you're not going to be able to see them, because in the handout materials are 3 essays which I would like you to take home, read at your leisure. One is called Prevailing Winds. Ignore CNN. Ignore Fox. Ignore all of that nonsense. It is designed to provoke you and make you anxious for clickbait. Okay? It is not designed to inform you. So first idea, here are some things that are true. I don't care what the chattering classes say. The first one is NIMBYism is getting worse. Everywhere in America. Like many a phenomenon, you guys invented NIMBYism and thank you for exporting it to the rest of the country. Okay? 2, all programs become more complex. The trap of fancy devices is we become dependent on them. When was the last time you actually read a map? Instead of just punching your destination into Google Maps and driving into the lake because you put the wrong street on it. Okay? 3rd trend, bank consolidation. I have not walked through downtown SLO, but I pretty much can guarantee that the ATMs that are out there are from some number of banks that aren't even headquartered in America. Very curious phenomenon, if you think about that. Okay? Nonprofits gain market share of affordable housing. This is an important trend. 45 years ago, affordable housing was regarded, I'm going to be crude, as a cinder block or cement block box with a pitched roof that you built somewhere in the underdeveloped part of town. You rented it cheap, you hired a caretaker, you dumped the poor people in there, decent, safe, and sanitary housing, we're done. It didn't work very well because we get things like the bad rented mobile home park. We get the really cruddy, very old 236 or D3, for those of you who know that sort of thing. Increasingly, we are seeing affordable housing as a public utility and a public asset and resource. And for a variety of reasons, we want nonprofits to be the people who own it. Meanwhile, America is broke. Sacramento is broke. San Luis Obispo is probably not broke. But what happens is, when a higher level of government goes broke, it decides that something it was previously doing, it will mandate lower levels of government do, and it will cut the RDA funding. Oh, because we're the state, we can do that. The crammer can cram on the crammee, okay? And you is the crammee, all right? Energy gets more expensive, carbon is going to be taxed. Cap and trade is great. Better way to do it is just tax the bejesus out of it and use it to plug budget deficits. By the way, the recent trend to legalize marijuana, all of that stuff, it has nothing to do with the aging of the baby boomers. It has nothing to do with the zeitgeist. It has nothing to do with changing attitudes. It's very simple. Legalize and tax is better than prohibit and throw them all in jail. Okay? There is further innovation version in housing policy, which we will talk about. And the last one I want to mention is broadband has gone to infinity, which means privacy has gone to 0. Get over it. Okay? Next, bending branches. Bending branches are stress forces that are acting until the branch breaks. Now you have windstorms. Where I come from, the branches get full of ice and the tree eventually breaks and falls down. It's one of the most awful things you can have, to be watching a tree collapse. Okay? 101. My generation is busy impoverishing your generation. We are the first generation of people in the history of the planet who can live until we go bankrupt. The quality of that life is not so great, but if you want to preserve life, we can hook you up to a whole bunch of things so that that silly EKG and EEG just keep going. It's the #1 worry of the elderly in America today, that they will become a drain on their children. 2, budget deficits are game changers in terms of revenue. All sorts of things are becoming possible. You will recall that the U.S. Supreme Court said California had to find a way to dump its prisoners into the population. I mean, that's a budget deficit problem Governor Brown has not solved, okay? State and local governments are overextended, you know that. The public housing system, when John was describing the history of U.S. affordable housing, he left out one part. In 1937, Franklin Roosevelt put the United States into the business of government housing, government affordable housing. It was the creation of the public housing system. First nation in the world to put the government into that position. And between 37 and 65, it was the only thing we did. Today, the system, not the people, operates on basically the same rules that Franklin Roosevelt invented in 1940 and 1941. which turns out not to work very well, because you have to have really very clever people trying to use 2015 thinking to solve regulations that were written in 1941 and have been updated once or twice since then, but not much. The CRA that John alluded to is obsolete. CRA said a bank has a geography. When was the last time you thought about the footprint of your bank? It's why South Dakota gets invested a lot of low-income housing tax credits, because they have a back office there. CRA is obsolete. By the way, do you have a credit card in your pocket that didn't come from a bank? Probably. Capital One? Not a bank. It's a credit card company. Okay? Walmart banking? Not a bank. Why don't they get CRA? Next idea of affordable housing. This one is very close to home. Increasingly, the people we house in affordable housing have another problem. Poverty is the symptom. Something else is the problem. Substance abuse, busted family life, previously incarcerated can't get a job, disability, all kinds of things. Just putting them in the box doesn't solve the problem. So we have to somehow or other, where should be housing, affordable housing exists for the purpose of helping people live better lives. If you throw them into the box and close the door on it and say, I don't know whether they're living a better life or not, but they're not homeless anymore, you've done something, I can't grant you that, but you haven't dealt with the problem. We understand now that resident services are critical to dealing with the populations who wind up in affordable housing. We have not solved the problem of paying for them. There is no business model right now for resident services. And last one, relevant here, because program complexity is greater, small owners are being squeezed out because they lack scale. The last time you went to an owner, the poor guy who did one 28-unit Farmers Home 515 project in 1968, and he and his wife have owned it ever since then. He's trying to keep up with the RD regulations. He's tearing his hair out, what's left of it, because the program complexity's gotten wider. And then lastly, I'm going to do this real fast. Every now and then, some damn thing goes by and we say, wow, I'm glad that missed us. I feel all better. First couple of things that could happen tomorrow or could happen never. First one. The Chinese wake up and decide they don't like dollars anymore. So they stop buying treasuries. They currently hold, I believe the number is $1.5 trillion of our nice, crisp $100 bills. What if they stop buying in treasury auctions? Interest rates go up 300 basis points, plus or minus. What do you think 300 basis points does to the budget deficit of your friend of mine, the federal government? I'll give you a clue. $600 billion increased deficit. The only reason that the national debt has only doubled in the last 8 years is because interest rates are low. And as somebody who lived through 78 through 82 when Paul Volcker decided that was not a good solution to the problem and racked interest rates up to 21% when I bought my first condo, I am scared to death that one day Janet Yellen wakes up and says we have got to continue selling treasuries and the Chinese aren't buying, and boom! That's kind of dramatic, okay? I think there will be a new CRA 2.0, not because it's obsolete, but because we can tax more financial institutions. I think at some point we're going to give up on the fair use privacy waiver. I think all of this stuff that we've been seeing, I mean, goodness gracious, you know, at this point, if you take a picture on your cell phone, why not just post it to your Instagram, no matter how unflattering it is? If you put it on Facebook, nobody will notice it. If you wait until somebody hacks it, it'll be on the front page of the Daily Mail, okay? We could have a problem where 3 million houses get foreclosed. Oh wait, that already happened. Remember that? That was a meteor strike. Somehow they survived it. For that matter, we could have cities go bankrupt. Oh wait, that already happened. They're still going bankrupt. It used to be unthinkable. Now it's like popcorn poppers. Which city went in, which city went out? The absolute best thing that happened to Detroit in the last 5 years, filing bankruptcy. Detroit went into bankruptcy with $18 billion in liabilities, came out with $11 billion in liabilities. Important idea, if you are over-levered, you cannot get back to economic health unless you clear the debt at a discount. So that's going to happen. And, by the way, they're going to raise taxes. Why? Because, to paraphrase Gordon Gekko, they can. Okay? Now, with all of that, and as I say, there's 12 pages of that, and I took too long to tell you, what makes a community actually successful? Well, I'm going to use a visual image that you undoubtedly can't read, but you probably remember from high school biology. And those of you who are in farming or near farming know that you got to do. You got to put nutrients into the soil, right? I mean, we got sunlight, which for our purposes we might call money. You got nutrients in the soil, which we might call subsidy or capital investment. Fact of the matter is, farms don't work unless you keep putting nutrients back in the soil. In biology, they call it nitrogen fixing, okay? Well, in the same way, communities depend on nutrients going into the built environment. That's the important idea. If you think about this for a moment, all of you who bought a house, okay, when you went in and bought the house, you did something which when you walked out of it, you went, my God, am I crazy? You took money. You took a portable commodity called money that you could spend anywhere, okay? And you invested it in a piece of property that 5 seconds after you bought it, you realized the screens don't work, and you got to fix the back door and all of that. Now, how do you get money out of property if you decided you made a mistake? Can I reverse the transaction? If I bought a house that was a mistake, how do I get my money out?
Sell it.
Sell it to whom? The next fool. I know you know this, but the curious thing here is that you take the most portable unit of capital, money that you could spend anywhere in the world. In Zimbabwe, this is legal currency because their inflation was 80 billion% before they gave up on the Zimbabwean dollar. I'm not making that number up, okay? You take the most portable, most transmutable currency in the world and you put it in a place. That's an act of faith. And the faith it's an act of is both faith that I want to live there and faith that somebody else will buy it from me, okay? So, in a good community, money is continuously going into the built environment to maintain, to upgrade, to enhance. In a bad community, money is coming out of the built environment. Go back to that thing when I was talking about where you got off the wrong exit on the freeway, and you locked the doors. It's because you were processing. That house is not maintained. The grass in that front yard has not been cut. There's a lot of fences and a lot of concertina wire. The public spaces are full of trash. There's a burned out car over there. It's like all of those are indicators of capital investments. Okay? So, the difference between a good community and a bad community is that in a good community, net money is going into the built environment. That turns out to be a massive distinguishing feature, which also suggests, by the way, that for all of you in Beautiful Slow, you should think about how to continue to invest in the built environment, even to expand it sensibly. You want to see the reverse? Go to Detroit. In 1955, Detroit had 2.1 million people. Today, Detroit has 700,000 people. Let's think about that. Population of Detroit has been cut by a factor of 3 over the course of 60 years. And what that does to property values, they've gone basically to 0. In parts of Detroit, property values have gone negative. In Cleveland, Fannie Mae has paid people $25,000 a house to demolish the house because it was worse to leave the house standing. Okay? So that leads to the next part of this whole thing, how we build communities. That is a picture of a foreign country that you may be familiar with. It's called Los Angeles. One way to look at that is that represents an overstressed intermodal transportation alternative between housing and jobs in a city that has bad urban planning. I just did that in the graduate school of design kind of description. You would call that a traffic jam. And Angelina would call that the 405 every day. Okay? The interesting thing about that is that the reason people are on those stupid roads is because they are going between their home and their job. Housing is where jobs go to sleep at night. Affordable housing is where lower wage jobs go to sleep at night. The community does not exist that has only rich workers. There are some poor workers in every community. They either live in that community or they commute up and down the 101 all day long. Take your pick, okay? Which leads to this curious idea. I want you to write this down. I learned this at Harvard. 1 equals 1 plus 1. If you add 1 job to your community, and we all want economic development, we all want to create jobs, every time you add 1 job to your community, you basically, shorthand, have to create 1 housing unit and 1 mode of commuting. The 1-for-1 on housing units isn't perfect because we have 2 income workers, but we also have retirees, blah, 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 but it's pretty close. 1 equals 1 plus 1. And the other one, which I didn't learn at Harvard, I learned at the National Housing Conference, H plus T equals 60%. What you spend for housing as a percentage of your income, plus what you spend on transportation as a percentage of your income, equals 60% of the average family's budget. Which means, if you think about that for 5 seconds, that if you improve transportation, you lower transportation costs, you push up housing prices, good thing. On the other hand, if you push up housing prices, you push housing out of reach for poor people, bad thing. So there's a tension there that you have to manage with. The other way I say it, this is the recent one, is that the way to create successful community you need, my acronym for it is TECH. I'm in California. You need to build transportation. You need economic development. You need to build community amenities and community resources. And you need to build housing. And you need to build them in rough parallel. All 4 of them in rough parallel. If you build any 1 or 2 without the others, you get an imbalanced community and a dysfunctional city. And I can take you to lots of places. If you build economy without transportation and community development, you get Cairo or Bombay, both of which places I have been to. Okay, 18 million people, and you have, when you go to Cairo, if you drive around in a car, you have a driver, you have a translator. The driver doesn't park the car because there is no place to park the car in Cairo. The driver goes and hides somewhere until the translator calls to bring the car back. So now we have 3 people to manage the commute problem of 1 person in good old Cairo. Third idea. All right, so that was fun. So how did you really? You didn't tell me he was going to depress us. But you guys live in paradise. You need a little bit of downer. Okay, so why hasn't government solved the problem for you? That's what we pay our taxes for, supposedly. First thing, every government, everywhere, sees the world as bounded by the Capitol building or the legislature or the immediate vicinity of those things. There's a reason Hunger Games is popular also. Okay? Every government thinks of itself as Pan Am and the rest of us are just District 12. Okay? They see it in that sense and they're going to prescribe something for the whole place. They're going to do it top down. Makes all the sense in the world. We've got the smartest people in the country. They go to Washington, D.C. They're going to invent something. It's going to work everywhere in America. The problem is everywhere in America is not like SLO or any other place in America. So they lose touch. Okay? And when you lose touch, bad things happen. I put this picture up because I'm old enough to remember when the milkman delivered the milk. And the milk, by the way, back then came in a glass bottle. We did recycling back then because those milk bottles were expensive. And the problem with that delivery system, I don't care how pasteurized it is, I don't care how cheap it is, if he drops the bottle, the milk breaks. Part of the reason people don't trust Washington anymore is because all Washington can do is put a milk bottle in a howitzer, put the GPS coordinates in it, go boom, and say, it's up to you to catch that and hope that damn thing doesn't break. Okay? Touch. Catching the milk bottle. You ever do one of those where they play the let's toss the water balloon thing? That's about touch. Touch requires localized counterparties. That's the $10 Harvard-approved word for you folks. Okay? Some things about touch. You have to cover the whole geography. You have to know everything about, let's say, the Tri-Counties or SLO or the vicinity of SLO. Because you're trying to deal with the problem of the whole thing, not just fix this part or that part, okay? You have to be expert across the whole system. And we call them mission entrepreneurial entities, and I'll talk about that term in a little bit. The other thing that touch means is it means combining products. Touch is about reversing the polarity of government. Touch says, you're the important person. What you need is what matters, so somebody has to bring you just the right combination of stuff you need. It's the reason that bodegas exist, and it's the reason that stores have clerks, to enable you to find the exact combination of things you need. Go into a 7-Eleven or a Circle K sometime and watch the staff manage inventory. They only have about 3 units of anything, but they have 1,500 anythings in a Circle K. And those places do a land office business, and it's because they invented a system with touch. Okay? Touch also involves trust. Americans, Californians may be different. Where I come from, Americans don't touch each other. You stand in an elevator, people in an elevator, they've done studies. If you look at an elevator from above, people stand in an elevator like the pips on a die. 1 in the middle, 2 in the corners, 3 in the corners, 4 in the corners, the 5th one sort of in the middle. By 6, it's really getting uncomfortable. That's why people look up, people look down. Okay? That's because Americans have a relatively large personal space, and we don't like being touched by people we don't know. Really creeps us out. Okay? Touch requires you to trust the person who's touching you. Would you let anybody from the TSA touch you? Probably not. Okay? So to do that, to make SLO work with this remote Sacramento and this further remote Washington, D.C., you have to do something that some of you are old enough to remember. In Ghostbusters, we have to cross the funding streams. Federal government brings programs down from the top. They come out of silos. Boom. We have a silo called housing, a silo called veterans. Okay, so we got a veteran who's got a bunch of substance abuse problems. He's got some PTSD to deal with. He needs a very supportive housing environment. He also kind of needs a job. So how are we going to combine his veterans benefits with his housing benefits? I know what we'll do. We'll say to the guy, go to the VA for this stuff, go to the housing authority for that stuff. How's that going to work? That's not going to work very well, okay? Somehow or other, somebody has to connect those things, cross the streams, okay? The other example is elderly people in affordable housing. There's something called a Section 1115 waiver of Medicaid that will allow Medicaid to be used, Medicare, to be used to pay for resident health services, which you'd think would be a good idea. It takes going all the way to the big house in Washington, D.C. to get a Medicaid waiver for your rinky-dink little 32-unit 202 project down the street. Okay? Lack of touch. So, John mentioned I started a nonprofit 15 years ago because I was frustrated with the state of affordable housing in the United States. 15 years ago, affordable housing in the United States was regarded as a solved problem. We had the perfect system. We had convinced ourselves we had the perfect system. I didn't think we had it, but I was tired of banging my head against it. So I started a nonprofit that works around the world. And one of the things we've concluded is that to deliver touch, you have to have what we call mission entrepreneurial entities. Sometimes you call them nonprofits, sometimes you call them CDCs. All of those I don't like terribly well as terms because they're needlessly restricting. It's an entity, it has a business, okay? It has a profit and loss statement, it has its own cash flows, it has its own bank accounts, it has its own staff, it has its own board. It is entrepreneurial. What it does adds value. Adds value for people, adds value for property, adds value for the communities. And it does it for a mission purpose. As George Burns said, sincerity is the key. If you can fake that, you've got to make it. Okay? I started out, I had my heart removed in the late 1970s, early 1980s, because it was resulting in illogical decisions being made. But I discovered upon removing it that this made it relatively difficult for me to communicate with people who were not autistic. And while the people who were autistic were fun, that kind of limited my circle of friends. So I created a synthetic emotional heart. But over time, the synthetic emotional heart actually started to do stuff. To this day, if I go by exit 7 on the Mass Pike, I can drive you to a crappy 220 unit project that I was responsible for recapitalizing and making into a success. To this day, that makes me happy, which is something, that's what heart is for, at least so they tell me. It's in the specs. Anyway, the critical attributes, by the way, a mission entrepreneurial entity could be a housing authority. For example, in Boulder, Colorado, they don't call themselves a housing authority anymore. They call themselves Boulder Housing Partners. Names do matter, okay? It has to have a goal of a mission purpose. It has to have a business purpose. It has to be hard on the dollars. And it has to be permanently legitimate. The governance has to answer the question, Kevin McCarthy, you want to give a bunch of money to solve a problem in San Luis Obispo, you're going to give it to somebody who is place-based and who has governance that assures your money will be well spent and will deliver value into the community. We think these things, which we call me's, rhymes with bees, like busy bees, just like bees and pollinating bees, we think these are the keystone species in successful, complex urban environments. And by the way, SLO is an urban environment. The town of SLO is an urban environment. One of the funny trends in America right now is that even in what you would call rural areas, the town area becomes more urbanized even as more green is preserved. The end state of this, by the way, is the United Kingdom, which is 65% permanently deeded for greenfield, and the 35% that isn't that is one giant traffic jam. Okay? That's not an exaggeration. They are growing in importance, and they are worth funding. We wrote a book about them. That's the picture of that. We did 11 US ones and 12 UK ones. We profiled them. The book is free. No salesman will call. Just give me a card with some variation of free book, please. Okay? The other thing, in John's story about affordable housing in America, 40 years ago when I started in this business, 40 years ago when I started this business, there was one place that everything happened. 451 7th Street Southwest, Washington, D.C. The HUD building. Everything that mattered came out of the HUD building. There weren't state housing finance agencies. There weren't CDCs. There was no CRA. There was no NeighborWorks. There wasn't any of these things. It came out of that one building. Over time, that has inverted. Starting in 1986, federal government started block granting the resources to the states. That's where the low-income housing tax credit came from. John alluded to CDBG and home. Those are basically block grants. Before CDBG, there was something called UDAG. In between UDAG and CDBG, there was something called HODAG. Don't ask me for more. Okay? It went to the states. The states block granted things. But then came CEQA. Then came the Palmer decision. Then came AB 1229. Then came the snail darter and every other blasted thing. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We have Nobel Prize winning NIMBYites. Really bizarre concept. They think because they won a Nobel Prize, they're entitled to opine on the sixth flat next door. Anyway, national housing policy gets beat at the city council. That's an interesting concept. Because what happens is, if a city gets good enough at repelling affordable housing, they can push it. San Francisco can push it to Richmond. Okay? San Francisco's got the stupidest zoning I've ever seen in the world. Do you know about sunset zoning? In San Francisco, except in certain designated corridors, you cannot build a building above a height such that within 1 hour of sunset or sunrise, the shadow of that building falls on any other property owner in that district. Which is why the entire western addition of San Francisco, when you go there, all of that stuff, that's why it's all that two-story boxy stuff. Now the thing is, if you can't go vertical, you go infill. which is why Los Angeles is currently the densest city in America, because they keep infilling the stupid lots because they've got this kind of zoning, okay? Our national housing policy has been thwarted by local stuff, which means, congratulations, you guys are on the front lines of reinventing this. Inclusionary zoning is a brilliant device. Does need to be calibrated, does need to be locally specific. I know enough about Palmer to say I don't know enough about Palmer, but inclusionary zoning is a clever device. And it is gaining in utility around the world. The UK has a version, Ireland has a version, so on. Back a couple steps, and I'm running a little long, but I promise to be done just about 3. Let's go back. I promise not to run long. You can get up and start leaving, I don't mind. I'll just point you out. Remember for the rest of my life. Double bottom line. Double bottom line requires 2 roles. There's one role that the government does. It gives resources, it sets policy. There's another role that what I call the me's do. They take those resources and they take risks with them to produce outcomes. The government cares about the policy outcomes. The me cares about not going bankrupt. Now that's perfectly legitimate. The government cares that the me doesn't go bankrupt, sure. The me cares about the policy outcomes, but they have different primacy. Because a housing MEE that doesn't care about the bottom line goes blub, blub, and doesn't serve anybody very well. The government decides what the goals are and seeks to reward the most socially deserving properties. That's what a QAP is, for those of you who do tax credits. The developer, for-profit, non-profit, whatever, tries to do the best deal. So the core activity of government is compliance, and the core activity of housing me is asset management or service delivery. These roles are complementary. Each relies on the other. This is insufficiently understood. Next week I'll be in Michigan explaining to a room full of developers that they should stop bitching at the State Housing Finance Agency because the State Housing Finance Agency has bigger problems than whether or not walk score is the appropriate measure of QAP points. It also means, the other thing about double bottom line, and this is a practical operational one, you all know that we have 2 brains, okay? You may not know that the 2 brains are actually separated by a piece of bone in the middle of your head called the corpus callosum. And in between those 2 parts of the brain, there's a little hole through which nerves run. Let's call this the 405 for our purposes, okay? The left brain, right-handed person, is the rational, calculating, blah, 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 blah thing. The right brain wants to smell the flowers and play and color outside the lines, okay? Most of the time, our left brain rules. Indeed, one can track growth, child, right brain, adult, left brain. Oversimplification, but not entirely ridiculous. And our educational system and our parental system and everything else systematically tells the right brain, you can only play when we give you permission to play, which children don't know how to do it very well, okay? But, key, to get action out of a human being, the left brain and the right brain have to agree, which is where the concept of self-rationalization comes from. Right brain wants cheesecake. Left brain says, that's 450 calories. Right brain says, so what? Me want cheesecake. Left brain says, well, okay, yeah, you did 12 minutes of walking in downtown. That's probably worth 450 calories, okay? Among the brilliant things about money is that money is a means of translating between the 2 halves of the brain. What's it worth to you? You'll find out, okay? The other thing that's important, particularly for anybody in this room with a mission purpose, don't tell a left-brain person a story about a big-eyed child with a doll. Left-brain person knows how to listen to that story, and once you're out the door, goes back to work. Tell a left-brain person a story that turns the big-eyed child with the doll into a quantitative measurement. This child was 3.5 happy a year ago. Now this child is 4.5 happy. Whatever that is, okay? That's the genius behind TripAdvisor, Yelp, eBay, all of these things. because they create wisdom of crowds means of quantifying. Our industry in general is scared to death of resident satisfaction surveys, scared to death of any kind of plebiscite of the people, because they might write down something that says we're doing a less than perfect job. But if you do that on a consistent basis over time, you track things. What if we tracked the grades of people in public housing? Did the kids who lived in our public housing get higher grades over the course of the 10 years they lived in the public housing? That's a metric of success, an indisputable metric of success, a metric that crosses the streams. When you think about community, you want to think about how can we quantify the benefits that are other than caretaker type benefits. All right? And so here's some challenges. And I'm going to do this real fast because I've got 6 minutes to go. Once upon a time, there was a nation called America. And in that nation, America was land of the free iced tea refill, the clean restroom, and as of right zoning. Okay? Parts of California, in fact, were once America. Now, in that America, it happened that if you made 80% of median income, you could buy a house. That was the American dream from 1949 to 1975. Roughly 65% of all American households in that period of time owned a house. 80% AMI, you own a house. For reasons that I won't get into now, between 60 and 80 of AMI, you could rent a quality apartment. The United States has the absolute best, most professional, most sophisticated permanent conventional rental sector in the world. Bar none. Very high quality stuff, very affordable. Between 60% of AMI and 30% of AMI, we created a program called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, which buys down the rents so people in that range could afford to pay those rents. Again, this is in America. Okay? I don't live in America either. Below 30% of AMI, there's a dirty secret. What you can afford for housing is less than the cost of operating the housing, even if we gave you the building. Which is why if you house the lowest of the low and charge them 30% of their income for rent, you have negative NOI. NOI is a term for our purposes meaning cash flow. Negative cash flow is a term for our purposes meaning losing money that you can't afford. Okay? So in America, we had a nice continuum. We had public housing with Section 8 vouchers for the lowest of the low. We had tax credits, we had market rental, we had first-time home ownership. And life was good in America. But some places, I won't mention any names, started to restrict growth. And by restricting growth, they started to push up the price of land and the price of housing. Now, it was true that in those places, we still had people below 30% of AMI, and they needed supported housing for reasons we talked about. And it's true that in those places, we still had low-income housing tax credits for people between 30 and 60. But market rental wasn't 30 of 60 anymore, it was 30 of something else. And home ownership was something even higher. And a hole opened up and it's called workforce housing. And the federal government does not know that that hole exists. That hole that I show you there is the only income and tenure configuration that receives no support whatsoever from any government program. All of you who own a house, remember something called the mortgage interest deduction? Random fact. The mortgage interest deduction is 4 times as costly to the federal government as every HUD program put together. 4 times as costly. Okay? Workforce housing is the only income and tenure configuration that is not funded by the federal government at all. And if everybody else is advantaged, we are disadvantaged. It's the reason that workforce housing is a big problem in SLO and other kinds of places. Okay? The other one, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip it. I'm just going to observe that if you're elderly and you start climbing the staircase to heaven, your physical circle of mobility shrinks. And yet each time that circle of mobility shrinks, we make you move. When was the last time you met an old person and you explained, somebody you know was talking about they're moving their mother to assisted living. And the universal response is, oh, I'm so sorry. And the secondary response, and when was the last time you ever heard of anybody anybody's mother or father being invited, offered that chance to move into assisted living, say, what a great idea, I want to move into assisted living. And if that's not good enough, Mom, we're going to move you into a nursing home. And if that's not enough care, we're going to move you into a hospice. And beyond the hospice, there's that cloudy place in the sky with the gates. Nobody wants to go there. But because our healthcare system has made the delivery of healthcare and the convenience of the provider more important than the emotional and physical health of the providee, that's what we do. I call them cathedrals of medicine. My mother died of Alzheimer's. We went through all of this. My stepfather died of a broken hip on his way to Alzheimer's. My father-in-law recently died, thank God, at home because he was briefly in a nursing home. We got him out, so we got to die at home, very 19th century kind of thing. Why do we do that? Why aren't we retrofitting 202s and elderly housing projects and bringing the services into the people? Hint, go to Pismo Dunes, down in Pismo Beach. That is the world's nicest naturally occurring retirement community, naturally occurring assisted living. No federal dollars, no government program. And yet that's a community of people who depend on each other. Okay? I'm going to skip this one because I talked about it before. I'm going to skip that one because I'm running late. I'm going to boil it down to 4 things. 1, government's ability to do it for us is shrinking. If it's to be, it's up to we. Okay? Government can mandate and it can fund. It can regulate, and it can chastise and hold accountable. Government's very good at that, okay? Government, as a beast, cannot innovate and cannot take risk. That's where you all come in. Housing is the key to make communities work, particularly affordable housing, because it's easy for the market to produce unaffordable housing. It is not natural for the market to produce affordable housing. Economies grow only when the community works and the housing work. Don't expect Sacramento to solve the problem. For God's sakes, don't expect Washington, D.C. to solve the problem. Figure out solutions at the local level because community innovation is more important than ever. That requires crossing the streams. And I am done. Thank you very much. And there was one person whose eyes were closed, but I'm not going to mention it. I will stay for questions, but I promised you I'd be done at 3 o'clock. So anybody who wants to leave, no problem at all.
I mean, David agreed to do this for us just to do it so there's no fee or anything. He's going to tack this onto our other thing, but anyhow, he's just graciously agreed to give this to us today, so I really appreciate him coming and sharing, and if there are some questions.
Yes, I have business cards because I write free stuff of that kind. If you like the free stuff, just give me your business card. I'll send it to you via email. Any viruses that come with it are yours to keep and share with your friends. And share with your friends, yes. Oh, and we have some supplemental materials in the back because, believe it or not, that was only 23 slides, and originally I had a 56-slide deck. And they said, even you can't talk that in the time available. The slides will not make total sense, but some of them expand on things that were there before. They've already been printed, so you might as well take them. Yes, question?
One of your slides that you flashed by, it said something like do away with low-income tax credits.
I didn't say I was for it. I said I think it's going to happen.
Okay.
I think there's it is easy to envision that as part of the grand bargain revenue raiser, we cut back on the mortgage interest deduction. Did you know that if you have an RV with a toilet in it, you get the mortgage interest deduction on that? Yes. You get a deduction for the cost of the RV with a toilet in it, because that's considered a home for deduction purposes. That's like $5 billion, okay? There are 3 grand edifices in Washington, D.C. called the National Association of Realtors, the Mortgage Bankers Association, the National Association of Home Builders, for whom the mortgage interest deduction and its close cousin, the real estate tax deduction, are the closest thing to the first 2 commandments on the tablets that came down from heaven. They cost us about $140 billion a year between the 2 of them. We cannot afford it. Sooner or later, the Congress is going to get the cojones to deal with that. But to do that and confront the 3 great behemoths, they also have to wipe out all that other little waste, fraud, and abuse kind of stuff. And the problem we have with the tax credit is that it tends to be used to produce $550,000 solar green medical marijuana clinic on the first floor, bike trail path, SRO supportive housing, et cetera, which does not play well elsewhere in the country. So, I think there is a significant risk of that happening, but the need will not go away. So part of what the message on that particular one was, recognize that if they kill that set of resources, then Governor Brown has a big problem. The communities in California have a big problem, and anticipate the aftershock that would occur at the California level. That's a meteor strike. That could happen. Yes, ma'am?
Do you think there's any potential that they'll expand the definition of affordable housing to include workforce housing so they have access to those programs?
I don't think that the federal government will do it, because if it costs money, the federal government won't want to. And if it doesn't cost money because they do something clever with balancing the income brackets, then all the very low income advocates will say, you're taking away our tax credit for your workforce housing. So my expectation is no.
Do you think Congress is going to be successful in killing Freddie and Fannie, and if so, what do you think is going to happen afterwards?
I think Fannie and Freddie will wind up regulated like any other bank, that they will have to have a cash collateral mandate, and they will have credit scoring consistent with that cash collateral mandate. I think the consequence of that will be that the 30-year multifamily fixed mortgage will go away. It'll be a 30-year AM with a 10 or 15-year balloon. I don't think that's the end of the world. There was a period of time where I thought we needed a 30 or 40-year fix to get the markets established. I think we could all deal with it. I mean, if tax credit deals have a 15-year cycle, there's no particular reason you need a 30-year fix beyond that. But instructively, Fannie and Freddie have been in the too hard box for 6 years now. Here's a trick question. How much money did the collapse of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac cost American taxpayers to date? Negative money. It cost us $180 billion in write-downs, all of which, since that moment, they have made back and then some. Part of the reason John was alluding to the funding of the National Housing Trust Fund is that Fannie and Freddie are making so much money that theoretically it could be funded. Now, along the way you will notice that your friend of mine, the federal government, essentially confiscated all the private shareholdings of all these private shareholders out of its convenience and hasn't unconfiscated that. So if you ever had any Fannie or Freddie stock, you got things saying, why don't you sign up for a class action lawsuit? I'm here to tell you, I sued the federal government once. It was a wonderful crusade, and I cannot recommend it as a business model for anyone. Yes, sir?
Find Freddie if Fannie Mae stock was good after the collapse.
Not.
I did for a while.
Well, it did a dead cat bounce. It came down, it bounced up, and came down again. Yes, sir?
You talk about communities that are successful, money
Net
goes
money
into
goes
them.
in.
Can you comment on the issue of gentrification?
Yes. First of all, societies get better when average incomes get better. America has been the most successful society because it is the most aspirational. Some communities will get better and housing will become more expensive. And as that happens, you have to take a portion of the gain that the city budget is getting off of the increased economic activity real estate value and create permanently affordable housing. It's one of the reasons I like rental or nonprofit co-ops in addition to freehold ownership, because if you have freehold ownership, then gentrification results in displacement, whereas if you have those other tenures, you treat the housing as a utility. It's like parking spaces that are always available for folks. I personally think gentrification is not a bad thing, because much of gentrification is people whose parents were poor, are not poor, and their children are rich. He's not sure.
Yeah, is anybody working on or any momentum or any other affordable workforce programs, throughout the country?
There have been efforts, but not. They tend to arise in Salt Lake City. or Santa Barbara, or suburbs of big cities where the classic case is the school teachers can't live in the town. That's where it's coming from. The problem is you have Prop 13, which complicates life. We have something called Prop 2.5. The way you get workforce housing is real estate taxes go up and so on. But as you know, Prop 13 has done very strange things to California real estate values and California politics for a long time. Yes, ma'am.
You've definitely alluded that the solution is in the community. The community has to invest in itself. But what directions can you give to, get that started in communities?
I'm going to start with something that sounds really data geeky. How many people are going to live in SLO County in 20 years?
Someone geeky would have to answer that question. Yeah.
Come up with a view.
Double the population, so...
Well, just hang in there. Over the last 50 years, the average American house has doubled in size. Random fact, okay? The average American household has shrunk. So 50 years ago, the household was 4 or 4.5, now it's like 2.5, okay? Well, if the first house I grew up in was 1,000 square feet and there were 6 of us, okay? Today, it would be 2,200 square feet and there'd be 3, okay? So if you think about that for just a second, the built environment is rising faster than the growth of population. So if you say that in 20 years, SLO County is going to have 50% more people, you're going to need plus or minus 2x the livable square feet that you currently have. Where are you going to get them from? If you're not going to create them, then you will not have the population in SLO County. That's where I would start, because it goes to this issue. If you believe that population growth is going to continue, then you have to build for it. And if you're going to build for it, you have to plan for building for it, because infrastructure after the fact is a stinker to put in. Infrastructure before the fact is so much more fun. Are you happy or are you not happy? He's not sure whether he's happy or not. Yes, ma'am.
We seem to have a lot of homes in this county that where retirees make mansions. And as the people are downsizing and moving off into senior living, it's like, can't we find creative ways to make some of these into more congregate housing? The trend right now is that they're vacation rentals.
Well, there are 2 ideas there, both of which are tricky to work with. I'll start with the easier one first. A very large single-family house is very hard to subdivide into a multi-unit structure. The plumbing, the bathrooms, the interior security issues, it's tough. That's one phenomenon. The second phenomenon is, people want to build bigger houses. They do, and one man's McMansion is another person's development. I don't criticize people for having bigger houses, just because there's a normative judgment there.
But is there a stock of housing that we might be able to take advantage of?
I come from a part of the world where you see an old school, elderly housing, or congregate housing, or SRO housing, okay? You see a warehouse, you see any kind of urban, large, durable structure that is in the old part of town, and you say, let's keep that building envelope, let's strip it, and let's put in something that's more high density, more people, and more service enriched. Okay, we have several very polite people who want to leave, but...
No, I'm just...
Okay.
All right. We thank David for coming, and
Okay.
I'll stay.
Thank you.